The salty breeze whipped at Dorothy Sullivan's face as she stood on the dock, watching her future sail away without her. Her hands gripped the handle of her valise until her knuckles turned white, tears threatening to spill from her blue eyes as the SS Carolina disappeared into the horizon, carrying all her dreams toward San Francisco. Dorothy had traveled all the way from Boston to New Orleans, and then to Galveston, Texas, with the promise of marriage to a man she'd never met, a rancher in Northern California who needed a wife. 3 months of correspondence had culminated in this journey, and now, because she'd stopped to help an elderly woman who had fallen in the street, she'd missed her connection. The year was 1872, and at 22 years of age, Dorothy found herself alone in a strange port with nowhere to go. "Quite a sight, ain't it?" a deep voice remarked beside her. "Though I reckon it's less impressive when it's sailing off with your plans." Dorothy turned to find a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and kind hazel eyes watching her. His clothes were dusty from travel, and the leather vest and worn boots marked him clearly as a man from the frontier. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair with a slight curl to it. "I'm Quinn Hayes," he said with a slight bow of his head. "Couldn't help but notice you seem a bit stranded." Dorothy straightened her shoulders, remembering her mother's warnings about strange men. "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Hayes. I just need to determine my next course of action." Quinn smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Well, Miss Sullivan, Dorothy Sullivan." "Miss Sullivan, seems to me fate has a funny way of redirecting our paths sometimes. That ship may have brought you to the wrong port, but perhaps it was the right one after all." Dorothy wanted to dismiss the man's philosophical musings, but she was truly at a loss. "I was to be married," she confessed. "I'm a mail-order bride, you see. My intended is expecting me in California, but the next ship isn't for 2 weeks, and I haven't the means to stay here that long." Quinn's expression softened. "I'm headed to Las Cruces, New Mexico territory. Got a ranch there. Not as far as California, but it's a decent town with good folks. You could find work there while you sort things out. The stagecoach leaves tomorrow morning." "New Mexico," Dorothy echoed. She'd read about the territory's wild, dangerous places where civilization was still taking root. "I couldn't possibly." "Suit yourself," Quinn said with a shrug, replacing his hat. "But the offer stands. I'll be at the Galveston Hotel tonight if you change your mind. Stagecoach leaves at dawn." As Quinn Hayes walked away, Dorothy looked back at the empty horizon where her ship had disappeared. She had exactly $12 to her name, no prospects in Galveston, and a fiancé who might not wait 2 more weeks. With a deep breath, she picked up her valise and followed the cowboy's retreating figure. The lobby of the Galveston Hotel was modest but clean. Dorothy spotted Quinn immediately, sitting in a worn leather chair reading a newspaper. She approached him with as much dignity as she could muster. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "I've considered your offer, and I believe I would like to accompany you to Las Cruces, at least until I can earn enough to continue my journey." Quinn lowered his paper and smiled. "Wise decision, Miss Sullivan. Let me arrange for your ticket." "I can pay my own way," Dorothy insisted, though her meager funds would be nearly depleted. "I've no doubt," Quinn replied, "but consider it a loan. You can repay me once you're settled with work in Las Cruces." The following morning, Dorothy found herself aboard a stagecoach headed west, seated across from Quinn Hayes and beside an older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Abernathy, the wife of a Las Cruces merchant. "So, dear Mrs. Abernathy said after they'd been traveling for several hours, what brings you to our little corner of the territory?" Before Dorothy could formulate a suitable explanation, Quinn spoke up. "Miss Sullivan is a teacher," he said smoothly. "Come to consider a position at our school. Dorothy stared at him, surprised by the lie, but Quinn merely winked. "Oh, how wonderful!" Mrs. Abernathy exclaimed. "We've been desperate for a proper educator since Miss Winters left to get married last spring. The children have been making do with Reverend Taylor's instruction, but the poor man knows more about Scripture than arithmetic." Dorothy smiled weakly. "I look forward to meeting everyone." As the stagecoach rumbled through the Texas landscape, Dorothy whispered to Quinn, "Why did you tell her I was a teacher? Are you not educated?" he asked. "Well, yes. I attended the Boston Female Seminary for 2 years. Then you're more qualified than anyone we have. Besides," he added with a smile that made something flutter in her chest, "it sounds better than mail-order bride who missed her ship." Dorothy couldn't argue with that logic. "But I haven't agreed to stay and teach." "No," Quinn agreed, "but you'll need employment while you're there, and the position pays $20 a month plus room and board at the boarding house. Enough to save for your continued journey if that's still what you want." Dorothy studied him, trying to discern his motives. He seemed genuinely helpful, but her mother had always warned her that men always wanted something. "And what do you get from this arrangement, Mr. Hayes?" Quinn's expression turned serious. "Las Cruces needs a teacher, Miss Sullivan. I have a dozen ranch hands with children who deserve an education. That's all." The journey to Las Cruces took nearly a week, with stops at various towns and way stations. Dorothy found herself increasingly comfortable in Quinn's company. He was well-spoken for a rancher, knowledgeable about literature and current events. Each evening at their stops, he would ensure she was safely settled before retiring himself. By the time they reached the outskirts of Las Cruces, Dorothy had learned that Quinn Hayes had come west after the war between the states, where he'd served as a Union cavalry officer. He'd purchased his ranch 3 years earlier and had gradually built it into one of the most prosperous in the territory. "There she is," Quinn said as the stagecoach crested a hill. "Las Cruces." The town spread out below them, a collection of adobe buildings with a few wooden structures mixed in, all arranged around a central plaza. A church with a simple steeple stood at one end, and various businesses lined the streets. It was smaller than Dorothy had imagined, but there was something charming about its rustic appearance. "It's not Boston," Quinn acknowledged, watching her expression, "but it grows on you." "It's lovely," Dorothy said, and found she meant it. After days of endless desert and mountains, the town looked like a welcome oasis. The stagecoach pulled into town, stopping outside the Las Cruces Hotel. As Quinn helped Dorothy down, a man in a black suit approached them. "Hayes." "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," the man said, extending his hand. "Finished my business in Galveston earlier than expected, Mayor," Quinn replied, shaking the offered hand. "Mayor Wilson, I'd like to introduce Miss Dorothy Sullivan. She's come to consider the teaching position." Mayor Wilson's face lit up. "Is that so? Well, Miss Sullivan, you are a sight for sore eyes. Our children have been without proper schooling for months." Dorothy smiled politely. "I look forward to learning more about the position, Mayor Wilson." "Wonderful. The town council meets tomorrow afternoon. Perhaps you could address them then." Without waiting for her response, he turned back to Quinn. "Everything quiet at your place while you were gone?" Quinn nodded. "Diego sent word to the stage at El Paso. No troubles." "Good, good. Well, I'll let you get Miss Sullivan settled. Mrs. Parkerson has a room ready at the boarding house. Word travels fast," the mayor added with a wink to Dorothy. After the mayor departed, Quinn escorted Dorothy to the boarding house, a 2-story adobe structure with a wide porch. A plump woman with graying hair greeted them at the door. "You must be Miss Sullivan," she said warmly. "I'm Edith Parkerson. Welcome to Las Cruces. Your room is all prepared." "Thank you, Mrs. Parkerson," Dorothy replied. "It's kind of you to take me in on such short notice." "Nonsense. We're just grateful you've come to teach our young ones. Dinner's at 6 sharp. Mr. Hayes, will you be joining us?" Quinn shook his head. "Gotta get back to the ranch, but thank you, Mrs. Parkerson." He turned to Dorothy. "I'll come by tomorrow to escort you to the town council meeting, if that's agreeable." "Yes, thank you," Dorothy said, suddenly uncertain about being left alone in this strange town. Quinn tipped his hat and departed, leaving Dorothy to follow Mrs. Parkerson to her new room. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk by the window. It was a far cry from her family's comfortable home in Boston, but after a week on the road, it seemed luxurious. "Rest up, dear," Mrs. Parkerson said. "You'll meet the other boarders at dinner. Just 3 besides yourself, Mr. Finch, our bank clerk, Miss Robbins, who works at the general store, and Dr. Collins, though he's often out on calls." After Mrs. Parkerson left, Dorothy sat on the edge of the bed, reality finally settling in. She was thousands of miles from home in a frontier town, about to interview for a teaching position she'd never sought. And what of her fiancé in California? She should write to him, explain what had happened. But would he wait, or would he simply find another bride? Dorothy unpacked her few belongings, changed into her least wrinkled dress, and made her way downstairs for dinner. The other boarders were friendly, asking about her journey but tactfully avoiding questions about her past. Dr. Collins, a man of about 40 with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, was particularly welcoming. "We've needed a teacher desperately," he told her over beef stew. "Education is what will truly tame the frontier, in my opinion." "I haven't been hired yet," Dorothy reminded him. Miss Robbins, a sharp-featured woman in her 30s, laughed. "Trust me, Miss Sullivan, they'll hire you. Unless you confess to some heinous crime tomorrow, the job is yours." The next morning, Dorothy awoke to find a package outside her door, a simple but elegant blue dress with a note. "For your meeting today. Consider it an investment in Las Cruces' future. QH." The dress fit perfectly, making Dorothy wonder how Quinn had guessed her size. She was still contemplating this when a knock came at the front door, and Mrs. Parkerson called up that Mr. Hayes had arrived. Quinn stood in the parlor, hat in hand, looking considerably more polished than he had on their journey. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean white shirt under his vest. "Miss Sullivan," he said with a slight bow, "you look lovely." Dorothy felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you for the dress, Mr. Hayes. It wasn't necessary." "First impressions matter," Quinn replied. Ready to meet your future employers. The town council met in a room adjacent to the mayor's office. 5 men sat at a long table with Mayor Wilson at the center. They rose when Dorothy entered with Quinn. "Gentlemen, Miss Dorothy Sullivan," the mayor announced. For the next half hour, Dorothy answered questions about her education and teaching experience. She admitted truthfully that she had occasionally taught Sunday school in Boston and had tutored younger students at the seminary, but had no formal teaching position before. "And what subjects do you feel qualified to instruct?" asked a thin man introduced as Mr. Greeley, the owner of the town's newspaper. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and basic sciences," Dorothy replied confidently. "Also needlework for the girls if that's desired." The council members exchanged impressed glances. "And how long do you intend to stay in Las Cruces, Miss Sullivan?" Mayor Wilson asked. Dorothy hesitated, glancing at Quinn, who watched her with an unreadable expression. I'm not certain," she admitted. "At least through the school year, if I'm selected." After a few more questions, Dorothy was asked to wait outside while the council deliberated. Quinn joined her in the hallway. "You were magnificent," he said. They'd be fools not to hire you. I feel dishonest, Dorothy confessed. I came here only intending to stay until I could continue to California. Quinn's expression grew serious. Do you still intend that? Before Dorothy could answer, the door opened, and Mayor Wilson beckoned them back in. Miss Sullivan, he announced, the council has voted unanimously to offer you the position of schoolteacher for Las Cruces, commencing immediately. The salary is $20 per month, with room and board at Mrs. Parkerson's included. School begins next Monday. Do you accept? Dorothy looked at the eager faces of the council members, then at Quinn, whose expression remained neutral, though his eyes seemed to convey something more. I accept, she heard herself say, and the room erupted in approving murmurs. Outside the mayor's office, Quinn offered his arm. Congratulations, teacher, he said with a smile. Let me show you your school. The schoolhouse was a simple adobe building with a bell tower, located at the edge of town. Inside was one large room with rows of benches and desks, a larger desk at the front, and a blackboard on the wall. It's not fancy, Quinn acknowledged, but it's solid. 28 students ages 6 to 16, though attendance gets spotty during planting and harvest seasons. Dorothy ran her hand along the teacher's desk. It's perfect, she said, surprised to find she meant it. But Mr. Hayes, I should tell you I did write to my fiancé last night explaining what happened, if he sends for me. Quinn's expression dimmed slightly. Of course, you have an obligation, he cleared his throat. But while you're here, you'll make a difference. These children need you. That weekend, Dorothy prepared for her first day of teaching, creating lesson plans and organizing the few books available in the schoolhouse. Quinn had delivered a crate of additional books from his own library, works by Shakespeare, Dickens, and several volumes on mathematics and science. These were my mother's, he explained when he brought them. She was a teacher before she married my father. I think she'd be pleased to know they're being put to good use. By Monday morning, Dorothy was nervous but excited. She arrived at the schoolhouse early, wearing her new blue dress and a white lace collar she'd hastily made from scraps Mrs. Parkerson had provided. The children began arriving at 8 o'clock, a mix of Hispanic, white, and a few Native American children. They regarded her with curious eyes as they took their seats. At precisely 8:30, Dorothy rang the school bell and called the class to order. Good morning, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I am Miss Sullivan, your new teacher. We have much to learn together, but first, I would like to learn about all of you. The morning passed in a blur of introductions and assessments. Dorothy quickly realized that the children's education levels varied widely. Some of the older ones could barely read, while a few younger ones were quite advanced. She would need to create multiple groups for instruction. At lunchtime, the children spilled out into the schoolyard with their pails and packages of food. Dorothy sat on the schoolhouse steps, eating the sandwich Mrs. Parkerson had packed for her, when she noticed Quinn Hayes approaching on horseback. How goes the battle for young minds? He called as he dismounted. Dorothy smiled. It's going well, though there's much work to be done. Quinn sat beside her on the step, watching the children play. They seem to like you already. I hope so. Mr. Hayes, may I ask why you've taken such an interest in my situation? Surely you have your ranch to attend to. Quinn was quiet for a moment. Education matters to me. My mother taught me that. And perhaps... He hesitated. Perhaps I recognize something in you at that dock in Galveston, a determination I admire. Dorothy felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. Well, I'm grateful. I don't know what would have become of me otherwise. You would have found your way, Quinn said confidently. But I'm glad your path led you here, even if temporarily. The weeks passed, and Dorothy settled into life in Las Cruces. Her students made progress, the townsfolk welcomed her warmly, and she found herself looking forward to Quinn's frequent visits. He often arrived at the end of the school day, sometimes bringing a new book for the classroom or simply offering to walk her back to the boarding house. 1 month after her arrival, Dorothy received a letter. The return address was San Francisco, and her heart raced as she recognized her fiancé's handwriting. She took the letter to her room and opened it with trembling hands. "Dear Miss Sullivan," it began formally, "I was dismayed to learn of your misfortune in Galveston. However, as I explained in our correspondence, my need for a wife is urgent, as my ranch requires a woman's touch and my daughter needs a mother. I have therefore accepted the offer of marriage from Miss Harriet Winters, who arrived on the ship you were to take. I release you from any obligation to me and wish you well in your future endeavors. Sincerely, Mr. James Whittaker." Dorothy read the letter twice, waiting for the disappointment or heartbreak to hit her. Instead, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had never met James Whittaker, had agreed to marry him out of desperation after her father's business failed and left the family destitute. The arrangement had been practical, not romantic. That evening at dinner, Dr. Collins noticed her distraction. "Are you unwell, Miss Sullivan?" he asked with professional concern. "No, I'm quite well," she replied. "I received news today that my previous engagement has been dissolved." The table fell silent. Mrs. Parkerson looked sympathetic while Miss Robbins made a clicking noise of disapproval. "Men," Miss Robbins said. "So unreliable." "Actually," Dorothy clarified, "he married someone else because I was delayed, and I find I'm not heartbroken over it." Mrs. Parkerson patted her hand. "Well, dear, that's for the best then, and it means you can stay with us longer, doesn't it?" Dorothy nodded, realizing that the prospect of remaining in Las Cruces indefinitely no longer seemed like a temporary solution, but a desirable outcome. The next day after school, Quinn arrived as usual. Dorothy showed him the letter without comment. He read it carefully, his expression giving nothing away. When he finished, he handed it back to her. "I'm sorry, Dorothy." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent a small thrill through her. "Don't be, I'm not." Quinn's eyes widened slightly. "You're not upset?" Dorothy shook her head. "I never met him. Our arrangement was one of convenience, not affection. I think perhaps—" She hesitated, gathering her courage. "Perhaps fate did bring me to the right port after all." Quinn stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Dorothy, The moment was interrupted by a child's shout. One of her students, young Timothy Baker, came running up with a skinned knee. The conversation with Quinn was set aside as Dorothy attended to the boy, but the words unspoken hung in the air between them. The following Saturday, Quinn invited Dorothy to visit his ranch. Mrs. Parkerson raised an eyebrow but made no comment as Quinn helped Dorothy into his wagon early that morning. The Hayes Ranch was about 5 miles outside of town, nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance. The main house was a large adobe structure with a wooden porch wrapping around it. Several outbuildings and corrals surrounded it, and Dorothy could see cattle grazing on the hillsides. "It's beautiful," she said as they approached. "It's home," Quinn replied simply. "Not as grand as some spreads in Texas, but it's good land with plenty of water." A Mexican man about Quinn's age emerged from the barn as they arrived. "Jeef," he called, then smiled when he saw Dorothy. "Ah, the teacher." Quinn made the introductions. "Dorothy, this is Diego Mendez, my foreman and friend. Diego, Miss Dorothy Sullivan." Diego bowed slightly. "An honor, señorita. My son Carlos speaks highly of your teaching." "Carlos is one of my brightest students," Dorothy said warmly. Quinn showed Dorothy around the ranch, from the barn with its horses and equipment to the bunkhouse, where most of the hands lived. Finally, he led her to the main house. Inside was far more refined than Dorothy had expected. The furniture was solid and well made, the walls adorned with paintings and bookshelves lined one entire wall of the parlor. "This is lovely," Dorothy said, examining the titles on the shelves. "You've built something wonderful here." "It's still a work in progress," Quinn replied. "But yes, I'm proud of it." After a lunch prepared by the ranch cook, Mrs. Figueroa, Quinn suggested a ride to see more of the property. "I don't ride," Dorothy admitted. "At least not very well," Quinn smiled. "Then you'll ride with me. Daisy is gentle and can carry us both." Dorothy hesitated, but the thought of being close to Quinn overcame her reservations. He helped her onto his mare, then swung up behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and Dorothy was acutely aware of his chest against her back, solid and warm. They rode along a stream that cut through the property, up to a rise that offered a view of the entire valley. Quinn pointed out landmarks and shared his plans for expanding the herd and adding more grazing land. "You've thought of everything," Dorothy remarked. "Not everything," Quinn replied softly. "Some things I never planned for." Dorothy turned slightly to look at him, their faces now inches apart. "Such as meeting a Boston schoolteacher who missed her ship," he said with a smile. Then more seriously, "Dorothy, I know you came to Las Cruces by chance, not choice, but I find myself hoping you might consider staying permanently." Dorothy's heart raced. "Are you offering me a teaching contract for next year, Mr. Hayes?" Quinn's smile faded. "No. I'm rather hoping you might consider a different sort of arrangement." He took a deep breath. "I'm not as eloquent as those authors you teach about, but I know what I feel. These past months getting to know you, I can't imagine Las Cruces or my life without you in it now." Dorothy turned fully in the saddle to face him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Quinn, I'm not asking for an answer today," he hastened to add. "Just asking you to think about it, about us." Dorothy reached up to touch his face, her fingers brushing against the stubble on his jaw. "I don't need time to think. I've thought of little else these past weeks." Quinn's arms tightened around her. "Does that mean?" In answer, Dorothy leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but held the promise of more to come. When they returned to the ranch house, something had changed between them. Their conversation flowed easily over dinner, and as the sun began to set, Dorothy found herself reluctant to return to town. "It's getting late," Quinn observed. "We should head back before Mrs. Parkerson sends out a search party." The ride back to Las Cruces was quiet, both of them lost in thought about what had transpired. As they reached the boarding house, Quinn helped Dorothy down from the wagon. "Thank you for today," she said. "It was wonderful." Quinn held her hands in his. "Dorothy, I meant what I said. I'm falling in love with you, but I want you to be sure. You came west for a specific purpose, and that's changed now. I don't want to be simply the convenient alternative." Dorothy squeezed his hands. "Is that what you think?" "Quinn, meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Missing that ship wasn't a tragedy, it was the beginning of finding where I truly belong." Over the next few weeks, Dorothy and Quinn's courtship became the talk of Las Cruces. They attended church together on Sundays, he escorted her to town socials, and occasionally she would ride out to the ranch on weekends. Dorothy wrote to her family in Boston, explaining her change in circumstances. Her mother's reply was cautiously supportive, though she expressed concern about her daughter living in such a wild place. Her father, however, seemed relieved that she had found happiness after the family's financial troubles. As Christmas approached, the schoolchildren prepared for their holiday pageant. Dorothy worked tirelessly with them on their recitations and carols. Quinn, meanwhile, seemed distracted, often riding into town for mysterious errands. The night of the pageant, the entire town gathered in the church. Dorothy watched proudly as her students performed, their faces glowing in the lamplight. Quinn sat in the front row, his expression one of admiration as he watched Dorothy direct the children. After the final carol, Mayor Wilson stood to thank Dorothy for her work with the children. "In just a few months, Miss Sullivan has transformed our school. I think I speak for everyone when I say we hope she remains with us for many years to come." There was enthusiastic applause, and Dorothy blushed at the attention. As the crowd began to disperse for refreshments in the church hall, Quinn approached her. "Would you walk with me?" he asked quietly. "Just for a few minutes." Dorothy nodded, intrigued by his serious demeanor. They stepped outside, where the winter night was clear and cold, stars blanketing the sky above. Quinn led her to the town plaza, which had been decorated with paper lanterns for the holiday. He stopped beneath the large cottonwood tree at its center. "Dorothy," he began, his voice slightly unsteady, "when I met you in Galveston, I told you that fate had brought you to the right port. I believed it then, and I believe it even more now." He took her hands in his. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought something to Las Cruces, to my life, that I didn't even know was missing." Dorothy felt tears welling in her eyes. "Quinn." To her surprise, he dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Dorothy Sullivan, I know this isn't the life you planned. I'm not the man you crossed an ocean to meet. But I love you with all my heart, and I would be honored if you would consent to be my wife." From his pocket, he produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light from the lanterns. Dorothy's tears spilled over, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Quinn, I will marry you." Quinn slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her deeply. When they finally broke apart, they realized a small crowd had gathered, watching and smiling. Mrs. Parkerson was the first to step forward and embrace Dorothy. "I knew it," she exclaimed. "Didn't I tell you, Thomas?" she added to her husband. "I said those two were perfect for each other the moment I saw them together." The wedding was set for spring, when the desert would be in bloom. The months of preparation passed in a blur of happiness for Dorothy. She continued teaching, though now everyone knew she would become Mrs. Hayes at the end of the term. Quinn, meanwhile, was making additions to the ranch house, expanding the kitchen, adding a second bedroom, and building a proper rose garden that Dorothy had mentioned wanting. In late February, a letter arrived from Boston. Dorothy's parents wrote that they had scraped together enough money for her father to travel to New Mexico for the wedding. Dorothy was overjoyed at the news, having feared they wouldn't be able to attend. Mr. Sullivan arrived 2 weeks before the wedding, looking tired from the long journey but happy to see his daughter thriving. His first meeting with Quinn was slightly tense, as any father meeting his future son-in-law might be, but by dinner that evening, the two men were deep in conversation about cattle prices and ranch management. "He's a good man," Mr. Sullivan told Dorothy later. "Your mother will be disappointed to have missed this, but she'll be pleased when she hears of him." The day of the wedding dawned clear and warm. The entire town seemed to have turned out for the occasion, filling the church to capacity. Dorothy wore a gown of cream-colored silk that Quinn had ordered from San Francisco, with a veil of delicate lace. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, Dorothy's eyes were fixed on Quinn, standing tall and handsome by the altar. His face lit up when he saw her, and in that moment, Dorothy knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Reverend Taylor performed the ceremony, his voice carrying through the packed church as Quinn and Dorothy exchanged their vows. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the town plaza for a feast prepared by seemingly every woman in Las Cruces. There was dancing and music, laughter and tears of joy. As the sun began to set, Quinn took Dorothy's hand. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Hayes?" Dorothy smiled at her new title. "Yes, I believe I am, Mr. Hayes." They said their goodbyes with Dorothy embracing her father long and hard. "Tell Mother I'm happy," she whispered. "Truly happy." Quinn had prepared the wagon specially for their journey home, with comfortable cushions and a canopy to shield them from the evening chill. As they drove away from town, Dorothy leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching the stars begin to appear above. "You ever think about it?" Quinn asked softly. "How different things might have been if you'd caught that ship?" Dorothy considered the question. "Sometimes. But then, I remember something my grandmother used to say. God's delays are not God's denials. Missing that ship wasn't a mistake, it was the beginning of finding where I truly belonged." Quinn put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, I for one am eternally grateful for whatever twist of fate brought you to Galveston that day." "As am I," Dorothy replied, turning her face up to his. "As am I." Their life together began in earnest after their honeymoon, a week spent at a hot springs resort near Santa Fe. Dorothy finished out the school year, but with Quinn's blessing, decided not to return to teaching the following term. They were hoping to start a family, and the ranch demanded much of her attention as well. Dorothy threw herself into learning ranch management with the same dedication she'd shown to teaching. Quinn taught her to ride properly, and soon she was accompanying him on his rounds of the property. She took over the household accounts, introduced new vegetables to the kitchen garden, and even learned some Spanish from Diego and Mrs. Figueroa. The town continued to grow, with a new bank building constructed that summer and a proper hotel the following year. Dorothy maintained her friendships in town, hosting a monthly sewing circle that became a highlight for the women of Las Cruces. In the spring of 1874, almost 2 years after Dorothy had first arrived in Las Cruces, she gave birth to a son they named William Thomas Hayes, after both their fathers. Quinn was a devoted father, often carrying the baby with him around the ranch when Dorothy needed rest. 3 years later, they welcomed twin girls, Elizabeth and Margaret. The Hayes Ranch became known not only for its fine cattle, but for its warm hospitality as well. Dorothy's parents eventually visited together, her mother finally making the journey west to meet her grandchildren. Mrs. Sullivan was initially shocked by the rugged nature of life in the territory, but came to understand what her daughter loved about it. "It suits you," she told Dorothy one evening as they sat on the porch watching Quinn play with the children. "I wouldn't have believed it, but this life has made you bloom." As the years passed, the Hayes family prospered. Quinn expanded the ranch, Dorothy established a small library for the town, and their children grew strong and healthy in the New Mexico sunshine. Sometimes, Dorothy would think about that day in Galveston, standing on the dock watching her ship sail away. What had seemed like disaster had been the beginning of a journey far more wonderful than any she could have imagined. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn presented Dorothy with a journal bound in soft leather. Inside, he had written on the first page, "To my beloved Dorothy, who missed her ship but found her harbor, with eternal love, Quinn." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, their children playing in the yard, Dorothy took Quinn's hand in hers. "You remember what you said to me that day in Galveston?" she asked. "Fate brought you to the right port." Quinn smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she had come to love. "Best words I ever spoke," he said, leaning over to kiss her. "And truer now than ever." Dorothy leaned her head on his shoulder, watching as their son showed his sisters how to spin a top. "I wouldn't change a thing," she said softly. "Not one single thing." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they had built together, Dorothy thought of all the twists and turns that had brought her here, the financial troubles that had driven her to become a mail-order bride, the missed ship, the chance meeting with a kind-eyed cowboy. Some might call it luck or coincidence. But as Quinn's arm tightened around her shoulders and their children's laughter floated on the evening breeze, Dorothy knew it by its true name: destiny. The years continued to unfold with the rhythm of ranch life, springs of new calves and planting, summers of hard work under the relentless sun, autumns of harvest and preparation, winters of close-knit warmth as the family gathered around the hearth while wind howled outside. By their 15th anniversary, the Hayes Ranch had grown to be one of the largest in the territory. Their son William, now 13, was showing Quinn's knack for understanding cattle and land management. The twins, at 10, were as different as sisters could be: Elizabeth quiet and bookish like Dorothy had been, Margaret wild and adventurous, always trying to keep up with her older brother. In 1889, when New Mexico was still 7 years from statehood, Quinn was elected to the territorial legislature. The position required him to spend several months a year in Santa Fe, and Dorothy often accompanied him, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of Diego, who had become a partner in the operation, and William, who at 17 was ready for more responsibility. It was during one of these trips to Santa Fe that Dorothy encountered a familiar name in the newspaper. James Whittaker, her former fiancé, had died in San Francisco, leaving behind his second wife and 3 children. The brief obituary mentioned his successful shipping business but said nothing of his ranch. "Penny for your thoughts," Quinn said, noticing her pensive expression as she folded the newspaper. Dorothy showed him the obituary. "It's strange," she said. "I barely remember what he looked like from the daguerreotype he sent. If I had caught that ship—" Quinn took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding band he'd placed there so many years ago. "If you had caught that ship, I'd have spent my life knowing something was missing, even if I couldn't name it." Dorothy smiled at her husband, noting the silver now threading through his dark hair, the lines that years of sun and laughter had etched around his eyes. At 45, Quinn Hayes was still the most handsome man she'd ever known, and her heart still quickened when he entered a room. "I wouldn't trade this life for anything," she said. "Not for all the shipping fortunes in San Francisco." Their children grew as children do. William attended college in Denver, returning with new ideas for modernizing the ranch operations. Elizabeth became a teacher like her mother had been, taking a position at the now much expanded Las Cruces school. Margaret, to everyone's surprise, announced her intention to become a doctor and was accepted to a women's medical college in Philadelphia. "She gets that determination from you," Quinn told Dorothy as they put Margaret on the train east. Dorothy shook her head. "No, that's all you. Remember how you wouldn't take no for an answer when I was stranded in Galveston?" Quinn laughed. "Best persuading I ever did." In 1896, William married Clara Mendez, Diego's daughter, uniting the 2 families who had built the Hayes Ranch together. Quinn and Diego, both gray now but still vigorous, stood side by side at the wedding, looking as proud as if they'd planned this outcome from the beginning. "Did you ever imagine this?" Dorothy asked Diego's wife, Maria, as they watched the young couple dance. Maria smiled, her dark eyes warm. When Diego first told me about the pretty teacher his boss was sweet on, I knew our families would be joined somehow, someday. The heart knows its own path. The turn of the century brought changes to Las Cruces and to the Hayes family. New Mexico was moving steadily toward statehood. Railroads had connected the once isolated territory to the rest of the nation, and modern conveniences like telephones and electricity were beginning to appear in town. Quinn, now in his 60s, gradually turned more of the ranch operations over to William and Diego's sons. He and Dorothy spent more time in the big house, entertaining visitors, playing with grandchildren, and enjoying the life they had built together. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching a magnificent sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Quinn took Dorothy's hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their nearly 30 years of marriage. "You ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Coming west? Staying in Las Cruces instead of continuing to California?" Dorothy looked at her husband, this man who had seen something in her that day on the Galveston dock that perhaps she hadn't even seen in herself. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment." Quinn smiled, the smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "Nor I," he said. "You know, I wasn't even supposed to be in Galveston that day. The cattle buyer I was meeting had wanted to reschedule, but something told me to keep the appointment." Dorothy leaned her head against his shoulder. "Fate," she said simply. "Fate," Quinn agreed, and the good sense to recognize it when it was standing right in front of me, looking distressed about a missed ship. Dorothy laughed, remembering her younger self, so proper and uncertain on that dock. "I was so determined to get to California." "And I was so determined you wouldn't," Quinn admitted with a chuckle. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were meant for something better than being some stranger's mail-order bride." "You mean you were meant for something better?" Dorothy teased. Quinn's expression grew serious. "We were meant for each other, Dorothy Hayes. Of that I have never had a single doubt." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky, Dorothy thought of all the paths not taken, all the chances that had led her here. A missed ship, a stranger's kindness, a teaching position she'd never sought, a love she'd never expected to find. William and Clara's children, Quinn and Dorothy's grandchildren, were growing up in a world vastly different from the frontier their grandparents had known. They would see automobiles replace horses, airplanes cross the skies, and who knew what other wonders the 20th century would bring. But some things remained constant, unchanged by progress or politics. The beauty of the land, the strength of family, and the enduring power of love that begins with a chance meeting and grows, like the Hayes Ranch itself, into something stronger and more magnificent than either person could have built alone. "I love you, Quinn Hayes," Dorothy said softly in the gathering darkness. "Thank you for being at that dock." Quinn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I love you, Dorothy Hayes," he replied. "Thank you for missing that ship." And so they sat together as night fell completely. Two people whose lives had been joined by what some might call coincidence, but what they knew to be destiny, a cowboy who offered hope to a stranded woman, and a would-be mail-order bride who found her true home in the most unexpected of places.